No serious student of Catholicism can ignore the massive and deeply influential figure of John Henry Newman. Newman has been characterized as perhaps the greatest Catholic theologian since Thomas Aquinas. And he was undoubtedly one of the most important theological influencers of the Second Vatican Council. His work represents the first and most notable attempt to place Catholic thought in dialogue with the Enlightenment. He was one of the most elegant stylists in the English language. When James Joyce was told that he was the most accomplished writer of English, the great Irish novelist responded, "Nobody has ever written English prose that can be compared with that of a prince of the only true church," referring, of course, to Newman himself. Newman was many things: controversialist, apologist, theologian, educator, poet. But through it all, he was a lover of the truth. Toward the end of his career, upon being made a cardinal, he summed up his life's work as follows: "For 30, 40, 50 years, I have resisted to the best of my powers the spirit of liberalism in religion," by which he meant the view that religious statements are not matters of truth and falsity, but only expressions of subjective sentiment. Seeking the truth, especially the truth about God, was the principal passion of his life. And it remained so until his dying day, for he ordered that on his grave there should be inscribed the motto, "Ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem," from shadows and images into the truth. John Henry Newman was born on February the 21st, 1801, in the heart of London. His father was a banker, and his mother was a descendant of French Huguenots. He came of age within the framework of Anglicanism, the national religion of England. At the age of 15, Newman underwent a kind of conversion experience that marked him for life. Under the influence of a charismatic preacher, he came to accept the basics of the Christian creed and to love Christian dogma. He also became convinced that he was saved, justified, destined for eternal life. In that same crucial year of 1816, Newman read a tract of church history. He was especially beguiled by the text from St. Augustine and the other church fathers. The interest in the early church remained steady and deep throughout Newman's life. In June of 1817, Newman was enrolled at Oxford University. And it's scarcely possible to overestimate the role that Oxford played in Newman's life. It was the place of his greatest intellectual, personal, and spiritual formation. What Paris was for Thomas Aquinas, what Florence was for Dante, Oxford was for Newman. Newman became a fellow of Oriel College and fell under the influence of John Keble, the author of a book called The Christian Year, which presented a version of Anglicanism that was firmly grounded in the ancient Catholic tradition. What this meant more concretely was a rootedness in the sacramental view that, in Newman's words, material phenomena are both the types and instruments of real things unseen. In December of 1832, Newman undertook a journey through southern Europe with an Oxford friend of his. When the two men came to Rome, they were deeply impressed by the many expressions of ancient Christianity that they found, but they were little impressed by contemporary Roman Catholicism, which they found superstitious and out of step with the patristic consensus. Newman resolved increasingly to make his life's work the finding of a middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism.
What did it mean to Newman to be an Oxford man?
It meant everything to Newman. So he comes here as a young man, as a student, and then stays for decades. He stays as a student and then as a tutor and then a fellow at Oriel College. Oxford is the key intellectual institution in British society, and Newman was rising through its ranks to be a key player. It's fair to say until his dying day, he remained an Oxford man, even though after he became a Catholic, he could no longer teach here, no longer preach here. And that broke his heart into 100 pieces when he had to abandon this place physically and spiritually. But he remained affected by it all his life. Read The Idea of a University, which he writes as a Catholic, but it's filled with the Oxford spirit. Very late in life, he did come back to Oxford, and it was a very important moment for him. But Oxford never left him. Upon his return to England in early 1833, Newman banded together with a number of like-minded ecclesiastics and scholars and formed the so-called Oxford movement. The various participants commenced to write essays or tracts on various aspects of church life and theology. Hence, the Oxford movement figures came to be called Tractarians. What precisely were they for? Newman laid it out in terms of three principles. First, the principle of dogma, which pitted the Tractarians against all forms of liberalism. The view, as we saw, that dogma is but a derivative expression of feeling. Dogmas have intellectual substance, and they matter for the life of the church. Secondly, the Tractarians believed in a visible church with sacraments and rites which are channels of invisible grace.
When John had heard in prison the word,
this is the sacramental principle that he learned from Keble. Whereas the mainstream of Protestantism had internalized much of the spiritual life, the Tractarians wanted to externalize and materialize it in accord with an incarnational sensibility. The third principle, which Newman eventually repudiated, was the anti-Roman principle. Though they wanted to Catholicize Anglicanism, the Tractarians felt that Roman Catholicism had wandered from the Church of the Apostles and the Fathers. Newman went so far as to refer to the Pope as Antichrist. Another principal complaint had to do with what they took to be an excessive devotion to Mary and the saints. In sum, he felt that Rome had substituted the authority of the Church for the authority of the Church Fathers. In 1841, Newman composed what would prove to be his final tract, the infamous tract number 90. In this essay, he laid out his familiar via media position, but he also chose to focus on a particularly neuralgic point in British public life, namely the holding of the 39 Articles. These were the basic statements of Anglican belief that had to be sworn to by anyone holding public office or a professorship at a major university. What Newman was attempting in Tract 90 was a Catholic reading of the Articles, according to his understanding of that term. Though the language of Tract 90 was pretty rarefied and the intended audience more or less academic, the response to it was widespread and incendiary. For Newman was touching upon a cornerstone of the British establishment. Consequently, in his own language, he was condemned as a traitor in every part of the country, through every organ and occasion of opinion, in newspapers, in periodicals, at meetings, in pulpits, at dining tables, in coffee rooms, and railway carriages. His life at Oxford, as he knew it, was about to change forever.
So what's the significance of this church, St. Mary's, and specifically the pulpit behind you?
Well, it's one of the great pulpits really in the Christian world, because John Henry Newman regularly preached from that pulpit when he was, the chaplain, the curate here. It was during his Anglican years. And Newman came in here, and they say he was not really an impressive looking figure, and his voice was very unimpressive. He mounted that pulpit and put little glasses on and would read a lengthy sermon. They would take probably about an hour to read, in a rather droning voice, never looking up from his papers. So we would say, terrible orator. But all these smart people here at Oxford deeply appreciated the gorgeous prose that he wrote. So as everyone has said, one of the finest prose masters in English. More to it though, they were full of biblical richness and full of theological splendor. So those who were in the know, those who understood the importance of the Bible and theology, came here. They say they jammed this church to hear Newman preach. He preached here for many years. You can find his sermons in these beautiful collections, and they are masterpieces of English literature as well as masterpieces of the spiritual tradition. Interestingly, when he became a Catholic, he realized Catholics weren't used to that kind of preaching. So he would just go up in the pulpit with a few notes and give a much shorter 10-minute homily like we have today. And I smile at it now, thinking here's one of the greatest preachers in the history of Christianity. When he became a Catholic, he kind of muted all that and gave much more off-the-cuff sort of remarks. But here from this pulpit behind me were delivered some of the really great sermons in the 2,000-year history of Christianity.
Looking at Tract 90 today, a modern audience probably would read it and go, there's nothing too controversial about that.
Right. We probably wouldn't get it, but in Newman's time it was like a bomb going off, because he was addressing this cornerstone of the British establishment, the 39 Articles, which were sworn to by anyone that wanted to be a professor, for example, here at Oxford. Anyone wanted to be a member of Parliament, anyone that wanted to hold a public position had to swear to the 39 Articles, which were the great statement of Anglican faith. Newman was giving a very Catholicizing interpretation to them. Well, this was touching on a very sore point. Go back several centuries behind Newman, and you have these great battles of the 16th century. Protestants killing Catholics, Catholics killing Protestants, the terrible divisions in English society. For someone in the Anglican world to say, hey, I think we can really Catholicize the operation, that was seen as a betrayal of Protestantism. And that's why Newman said he was pilloried as a traitor all over the country. It was not just a matter of disagreeing about fine points of theology. It was betraying the Protestant Anglican heart of the society. And Newman knew it. He knew that was going to happen. In the wake of the Tract 90 controversy, Newman was compelled to resign his leadership of the Oxford movement, and he entered into a period of intense study and prayer. He took up residence in the village of Littlemore, just outside of Oxford, living in a converted horse stable in great simplicity and under a quasi-monastic discipline. There he returned to the close reading of his beloved church fathers. What he found took his breath away. As we have seen, Newman prided himself on staking out a via media, a middle way between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. But when he examined the fierce arguments that raged in the 4th and 5th centuries concerning the identity of Christ, he found 3 positions, 2 extreme and 1 mediating. One extreme was heretical, and so was the middle position. But the other extreme was orthodox, and that turned out to be the position of the Catholic Church up and down the centuries. He saw a devastating analogy between the ancient scenario and the present-day situation. Protestants seem to be on the extreme left, Catholics on the extreme right, and Anglicans taking up the middle position. Around the same time, he came across an article that cited an adage by the great St. Augustine, Securus judicat orbis terrarum, which roughly translates, "It is the whole world that judges securely." This hit him like a thunderbolt. The adage implies that the entire church, across space and time, best judges the truth of Christian doctrine. But the Anglican Church was, by definition, the church of a particular country and culture. Moreover, antiquity, Newman's lodestar, was only one moment in the church's history, not the whole of it. Newman's conversion was not like Paul's. It was more like Augustine's, slow, meditative, unfolding over time. After much agonizing thought and prayer, Newman, on October the 8th, 1845, dramatically knelt before Father Dominic Barbary, a well-known Passionist priest, and asked to be received into the Catholic Church.
Did Newman enjoy being a controversial figure?
I would say absolutely not. He was a typically retiring kind of academic. I think his favorite day would probably be quietly reading and writing. When he was a controversial figure as an Anglican, when he began making moves in a more Catholic direction, he was vilified all over the country. And it broke his heart. So no, I would say he very much enjoyed retiring to private places to read and write, did not like particularly being a public figure.
What are your thoughts about where we are right now?
Yeah, it's very moving to me to be in this place. We're at Littlemore, which is a converted stables, and you can see that as you approach it. Newman came here with a group of friends and disciples while he was still an Anglican, and it was a place of retirement and prayer and study. And then he became a Catholic. He was received in the Catholic Church in this place. So just over there across the room, he was received by Father Dominic Barbary, who was a famous preacher and kind of evangelist, Catholic evangelist. And Newman came to him and threw himself at his feet by the fireplace and said, "Hear my confession, receive me into the bosom of the Catholic Church before it's too late," like before he goes back. So Newman, one of the most famous converts of the history of the church, to be in the place where he moved in that direction and where he was finally received in the Catholic Church. And then to be here near his writing desk, to me, was very moving. One of the best writers in English, one of the great theologians of the last 500 years, and to be at the place where he actually composed these beautiful texts and thought them through. It reminded me of being in the cell of Thomas Aquinas in Naples. To be in the place where these great minds did their work, it's really powerful to me. After some hesitation, Newman decided to become ordained as a Catholic priest, and consequently made his way to Rome and seminary studies at the Propaganda College. This period was a difficult and often awkward time for Newman, one of the greatest theological minds in Europe, compelled to attend classes with seminarians. It's fair to say that Newman was not overly impressed with the quality of the theological education he received in Rome. We must keep in mind that this was a fairly decadent period in the history of Catholic theology, scholasticism having ossified into something cramped, self-referential, and defensive. At one point, Newman had a formal audience with Pope Pius IX. While bending to kiss the Pope's foot, which was the custom at the time, Newman knocked his head on the papal knee. Later, he commented that this pretty much summed up his relationship with Pius IX. While in Rome, Newman became acquainted with the Roman oratory of St. Philip Neri. This was a community of secular priests living under a rule, but not under vows. Newman was charmed by the urban setting of the oratories and by the intellectual discipline of the community, but especially by the shining example of St. Philip Neri himself. After a good deal of thought and prayer, he resolved to join their company and to establish an oratory in England upon his return. Newman was ordained to the Catholic priesthood on May the 30th, 1847, and then spent a few months in an Oratorian novitiate. He arrived in London on Christmas Eve of that same year and began the second half of his life.
What did it mean for an Anglican to become a Catholic in 1845?
It was like an earthquake, like a disaster. I mean, so we think today someone goes from being an Anglican to being a Catholic, we'd say, oh, good, I'm glad you're following your conscience and good for you. But gosh, in Newman's time, it meant your whole life collapsed. Think of Newman here now, mid-19th century. He's mid-career. He's a nationally known figure. He's a professor at Oxford University, one of the leading lights in the Anglican Church. He's a key member of the British establishment. To become a Catholic meant you abandoned all of that. You couldn't teach at Oxford, you couldn't preach at Oxford, you could not be part of the Anglican establishment. You were exiling yourself from this whole life. So Newman knew that, which is why it was so wrenching and heartbreaking for himself, his family, his friends. That's why it took an enormous amount of courage. You don't think of Newman as a exemplar of courage, but you should. It took enormous courage to make that plunge, because intellectually he was convinced Catholicism is the right religion. And before God, he felt he had to do it, even though it cost him enormously. Then, of course, think about this. He becomes a Catholic. Did the Catholics receive him with open arms? Well, some did, but many were deeply suspicious of him. They said, well, he's a former Protestant minister. He was an Oxford professor. How can we trust him? So the Protestant establishment was down on him, and the Catholic establishment was suspicious of him, which is why he felt really at midlife that he was a failure. He was rejected by everybody. In 1849, Newman founded an oratory in the industrial city of Birmingham. His first major work as a Catholic, Lectures on the Present Position of Catholics in England, is a wonderful example of his apologetic or controversial writing. Newman was a wicked satirist and polemicist, and nowhere are these gifts on fuller display than in these lectures. In 1851, Newman was invited by Archbishop Paul Cullen of Armagh, the Primate of All Ireland, to become the rector of a new Catholic university the Archbishop was forming in Dublin. In connection with his new position, Newman delivered in Dublin a series of lectures on the nature of university education. These were immediately and immensely popular, and were later collected as a book, The Idea of a University, one of Newman's most important. Unfortunately, Newman's administration of the Catholic University of Ireland was a somewhat rocky affair. From the beginning, he faced opposition from many of the Irish bishops who were suspicious of him personally, but also some of his novel ideas about university education. Deeply frustrated, he resigned the rectorship in 1859. It's fair to say that Newman's honeymoon as a Catholic was short-lived. Most Anglicans, of course, viewed him as a traitor, and many English Catholics were suspicious of his work. In March of 1859, Newman accepted the editorship of the Rambler magazine, a journal with a somewhat liberal reputation. He rode that horse for only a year, for a great controversy arose from an article that he penned for the Rambler called "On Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine." Conservative Catholics were unanimous in criticizing him, and Pius IX himself let it be known, through the Bishop of Westminster, that he was not pleased with Newman's ideas. The years following his resignation from the editorship of the Rambler were by all accounts the worst of Newman's life. Of a somewhat depressive character by nature, he was at this point in his life overwhelmed by feelings of rejection and failure. He said he felt like Sisyphus. This period of depression and rejection ended in 1864 with the publication of Newman's spiritual autobiography called Apologia pro vita sua. Prompted by sharp criticism from an Anglican controversialist named Charles Kingsley, Newman composed a beautifully written and compelling account of his conversion to Catholicism. People all over England lined up to read the chapters as they appeared in serial form. The Apologia made Newman once more a major figure in England, and he remained for the rest of his life in great demand as a speaker and writer. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII, who had succeeded Pius IX, named John Henry Newman a cardinal of the Catholic Church. This approbation was a triumph for Newman, whom Pope Leo characterized as il mio cardinale, my cardinal. John Henry Cardinal Newman died on August the 11th, 1890, at the Birmingham Oratory. He was beatified by Pope Benedict XVI in September of 2010.
Do you think Newman would be surprised to see us here 150 years later?
Yes, I do. Newman had a sense of himself that was rather modest, and I don't mean that in sort of the sense of falsely modest. Newman would often deny that he was even a theologian. I would say he's arguably the greatest Catholic theologian since Thomas Aquinas. He himself did not see his work that way. So I think, yes, he would be surprised. But, very soon after his death, a lot of serious people took him very seriously. He is, I think you could argue, the single greatest influence at Vatican II. So the Vatican II documents are almost unthinkable apart from John Henry Newman. Many of the major players in mid-20th century Catholicism, from Bouillet to Balthasar to Ratzinger, many others, claim Newman as an influence. So Vatican II is unthinkable without him, which means the contemporary church. But to answer your question, I'd say yes, he'd be surprised to see us here, but he shouldn't be. He shouldn't have been surprised. The first of Newman's major works I want to consider is his mid-career masterpiece, an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, a work that he began when he was still an Anglican and which he finished as a Roman Catholic. The central argument is an anti-Protestant one. Luther and his disciples had said that many elements within Catholicism represented deviations from or unwarranted additions to the biblical revelation. Therefore, they felt a pruning was needed. Newman argued that these elements represented not deviations from, but developments of the biblical revelation. Keep in mind this text was written in the mid-19th century, and it was part of a general movement of thought called Lebensphilosophie, or philosophy of life, whose practitioners included Hegel and Darwin. Evolution theory was in the air. Newman says that doctrines are like living organisms that evolve over time, only gradually revealing the fullness of their meaning. This is because an idea, in Newman's language, is commensurate with the sum total of its possible aspects. We can't really know an idea until all of its faces, dimensions, and profiles have disclosed themselves, and that disclosure takes time. To quote Newman again, there's no one aspect deep enough to exhaust the contents of a real idea. This process requires time. It also requires the energy of a community of discourse. Ideas are mulled over, debated, analyzed, considered, turned upside down, tossed back and forth, all in a lively, argumentative enterprise. And this process is not obscuring, it's clarifying. Newman illustrates this point with a striking analogy. I'm quoting him. It is sometimes said that the stream is clearest near the spring. Whatever use may fairly be made of this image, it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or a sect, which on the contrary is more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep and broad and full. And only in light of this analogy can we properly grasp the meaning of one of Newman's most famous adages. In a higher world, it is otherwise. But here below, to live is to change. And to be perfect is to have changed often. This is no celebration of change for its own sake, or a call to permanent revolution. It is an affirmation that the development of doctrine that is on display in Catholicism is a sign of life and not of decadence. One of the cleverest and most surprising moves that Newman makes in this text is to show that development, the lively unfolding of doctrine, has to be accompanied by the affirmation of the Church's infallible teaching authority. As we've seen, ideas develop through the work of writers and professors and critics and commentators. But development can be accompanied by corruption, evident enough from the number of heresies that have sprung up in the life of the Church. Therefore, in order to discipline, limit, and sanction the body of theologians, there needs to be an authority who stands above the fray and who can make a sort of umpiring judgment in regard to disputed questions. Newman's argument can be laid out in neat logical form. If revelation is part of the divine dispensation, and if the contents of revelation necessarily develop over time and space, God must have desired that His church be gifted with a living voice of authority. Now, Protestants had held that the Bible itself plays the role of infallible guide within the church. But the sheer number of Protestant churches, each claiming the sure guidance of the Bible, gives the lie to that interpretation. Many Anglicans, including the young Newman himself, had held that the consensus of the church fathers plays the umpiring role. But Newman came to realize that the fathers' writings did not constitute a living voice that could actively determine truth and falsity in the here and now. The only Christian church that claimed to have a living and infallible voice of authority, Newman concluded, was the Catholic Church. And this was one of the principal reasons that he crossed the Tiber. Keep in mind that he was writing this text precisely as he was making the move to Catholicism. What makes this text so compelling for our time is the manner in which Newman addresses the concerns of both liberals and conservatives. On the one hand, he nods vigorously towards a liberalism that would insist upon the importance of change and development in the life of the church, even at the level of doctrine. By the same token, he nods with equal vigor towards a conservatism that would insist upon the necessity of an infallible authority. His peculiar genius was to have seen how these two features are not mutually exclusive, but mutually implicative.
Could you elaborate more on the idea that doctrines develop?
Well, if a doctrine is a living thing, it can be compared to a tree, for example. If you could, what's the tree? What's the tree all about? I can go back to the beginning of the tree and say, well, it began as this little seed or acorn or something. But trees are a lot more interesting as they unfold and develop. So look at this thing. Over probably, decades, centuries, this tree has unfolded. Look at the complexity of it. Responding to different things in the environment, responding to the change of seasons, et cetera, et cetera. And what you get now is this richly complex living thing. Newman felt doctrines were like that. And the instinct should not be, let's go back to the beginning. In some ways, they were less interesting in the beginning, far less interesting. And let's look at them now in their fully developed state. So the Protestant instinct, he felt, was to see corruption, where his instinct was to say development. He often used the image, too, of a river. So a river like the Mississippi or something is not all that interesting at the source. In fact, you can jump over the source of the Mississippi, but now go down to the mouth of it in New Orleans. It's been fed by all sorts of streams, it's deepened, it's broadened, and now you got this wonderful, rich reality. Doctrine's more like that. An example would be, let's say the doctrine of the Trinity. Did St. Peter himself understand the doctrine of the Trinity better than, let's say, Thomas Aquinas? Probably not. It was at the very beginning. Was it given to St. Peter and the first Christians in seminal form? Yeah, it was. But only over many centuries. And through that lively play of minds I talked about. Only through that process does it develop in what we have now, this richly complex doctrine of the Trinity. Newman was very sensitive to this fact, and I think there he's been dead right. We recall that the idea of a university is a compilation of 9 lectures that Newman gave in Dublin in 1852 on the subject of university education. They constitute one of Newman's best-loved works, and they are marked through and through by the master's incomparable prose style. The central theme, addressed explicitly or implicitly throughout, is that theology properly finds its place in the circle of subjects in the university curriculum, that the study of the faith is a properly intellectual discipline. Another major concern of Newman's is to encourage Catholics to step out of their intellectual ghetto and to engage the university world with greater confidence. Many in Newman's time held that religion, precisely as a private affair and a matter of feeling, had no place at a university. But Newman countered that such a subjectivization of religion is repugnant to the mainstream of the Christian tradition, which holds that religion speaks of an altogether objective reality, who is the beginning and end of all things, who impinges on the whole of history, who as creator has to do with absolutely everything that exists. Therefore, a university, which by definition includes all disciplines, certainly ought to contain the discipline that speaks of God. Given, in fact, the nature of its subject matter, religion ought to be not only in the circle of disciplines, but at the center of it. In point of fact, the expulsion of religion from the circle of university courses will lead inevitably toward the supplanting of religion by some other discipline. This will happen because of that deep human instinct for the philosophic, by which Newman means a passion for the whole, for a totalizing vision. But this results in the skewing of all the other disciplines. If, for example, one of the physical sciences takes the central place, if we read all things through the scientific lens, we will distort or miss altogether huge swaths of reality. Or if economics takes the central place, as it does in all forms of Marxism, then everything else, the sciences, art, philosophy, will be seen as but epiphenomena of an economic substructure. The permanent expulsion of religion from the university will result, Newman felt, in a constant succession of false pretenders to centrality, and hence to a permanent destabilizing of the university. In the fifth of his discourses, Newman defends the ancient Aristotelian idea that abstract knowledge is good in itself, even if it does not have a practical consequence. In the mid-19th century, the view, now widespread indeed, that education should have above all a practical purpose was taking hold. Newman stood athwart this conception. He held that the highest kind of knowledge is useless. That is to say, pursued completely for its own sake, as a good in itself. Philosophy, literature, the arts, etc., are liberal in the measure that they are free from utility, and this makes them specially sublime. He cites Aristotle in this context, writing, "Of possessions, those rather are useful which bear fruit, those liberal which tend to enjoyment." Newman wanted his audience to appreciate the beauty of a cultivated mind for its own sake, and not to reduce it to some other value, be it political or practical, moral, or even religious. The purpose of a university education, he thought, is to produce a gentleman, and that means someone with a philosophical frame of mind. Now, Newman knew perfectly well that the saint is something other than a gentleman. Whereas the gentleman tends to be balanced, equable, tolerant, or in Newman's language, like an easy chair or a good fire, which do their part in dispelling cold and fatigue. The saint is typically edgy, extreme, impolitic. The church's job is to make saints. The university's job is to make gentlemen.
Why is Newman's idea of a university still relevant today?
I think it's relevant for a lot of reasons, but I isolate one in particular, which is the insistence upon the importance of a liberal education. We tend to be, especially in America, very oriented toward the pragmatic. So we're good at the mechanical, we're good at the industrial, we're good at the practical. We have wonderful machines that enable us to live life in an easier way. But then the question is, what do you do when your machine has gotten you where you want to be? What do you do when the practical things have done their job and now you're ready to savor? See, I think of our culture, we're like, go, 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 get someplace fast. Fine, now you're there. What are you gonna do? So some people will get someplace fast, they're with their friends, and they don't know how to have a cultivated conversation. They don't know how to rest. It's interesting, that word rest, we think of like, put your arms back and rest in a hammock. That's not what the word means in Latin. It has the sense of savoring. That's why when you say, for example, may he rest in peace, we don't mean may he lie in a hammock forever. We mean may he now savor the beauty and goodness of God, resting in peace. We've forgotten how to rest in things. We're go, go, go to get there. But a liberal education teaches you now what to do when you get there, which is to rest in the good, the true, and the beautiful, and really cultivate them. That's why I think the book is so important to our time. John Henry Newman's masterpiece, The Grammar of Assent, was published in 1870 when he was 69 years old. This book explored the theme dearest to Newman's heart, one that he had puzzled over all his life, namely the relationship between faith and reason. More precisely, Newman wanted to know how we come to assent to religious propositions. What it is precisely that makes us say, in regard to a religious doctrine, this is true. What he came to see clearly, and the entire book really lays out this intuition, is that certitude, the obsession of most modern philosophers, was the wrong starting point. The right point of departure is assent, the psychological and intellectual act of accepting a proposition. His first move is to distinguish between what he calls notional assent and real assent. By notional assent, we acquiesce to abstract propositions, to mathematical formulas, to philosophical ideas. But by real assent, we come to accept concrete things, images, and impressions. So, for example, one might entertain the notion that slavery is a bad thing, but that conviction might float on the surface of one's intellectual life until one comes into real visceral contact with slavery. In the American context, we might speak of the influence that Uncle Tom's Cabin had on the national psyche in the 19th century. In a similar way, the verses of Scripture, which one memorized as a child and to which one gave a sort of notional assent, take on enormous power as they are brought before the imagination as real objects. A basic contrast between the two types of assent is this. Real assent affects action and behavior in a way that notional assent never can. Here are Newman's own words. Persons influence us. Voices melt us. Looks subdue us. Deeds inflame us.
Now take a few steps.
Now, in regard to religion, notional assent is given to the whole range of dogmas and doctrines. And Newman certainly held to the importance of this. But can real assent be given to God, who's essentially spiritual, immaterial, ethereal? The ground of real assent in matters of religion, and we come here to a central Newman theme, is conscience. Newman characterizes conscience in a vivid way. Here are his own words. It is a certain keen sensibility, pleasant or painful, attendant upon certain of our acts, which in consequence we call right or wrong. It's fascinating, he thinks, that we refer to conscience as a voice, a term we wouldn't use in connection with, say, our aesthetic sensibility. Somehow through conscience we know that we please or offend a person by our acts, Indeed, a person powerful enough to see and judge all that we've done. The section of the Grammar of Assent that's the most technical and the most influential is the one in which Newman takes on the thought of John Locke, the great English philosopher. Locke had said, the quality of one's assent should be tightly correlated to the quality of the inferential support that one can muster for it. In other words, if the inferential support is slight, then the assent should be slight. If the argument is stronger, then the assent should be stronger. If the argument is clinching, then the assent should be absolute. But Newman saw that, in point of fact, we often give total assent to propositions for which there is far less than clinching inferential support. In his famous example, no one hesitates even slightly in affirming that Britain is an island. Though there's no absolute logical justification for that claim, rather, the assent is based upon a whole congeries of hunches, intuitions, testimonies, perceptions, and hints, none of which by itself would constitute a proof, but all of which taken together move the mind to assent. The upshot of all this is that assent, pace Locke, is not reducible to inference. That we live on a global planet covered with tracts of land and sea, that we had parents, that we cannot live without food, that one day we will die. None of that is known with apodictic certitude, but all of it is assented to without hesitation. We come to assent through an extremely subtle, indeed invisible or largely unconscious process of weighing converging probabilities. Newman invented a term for this feel, this intuition. He called it the illative sense. Angels don't require an illative sense, but human beings do. Why does all this matter? Well, if you want to draw people to accept the truths of the Christian religion, if you want, in a word, to evangelize, you have to use both formal and informal logic. You have to construct syllogisms, yes, but you also have to bear witness. You have to make arguments, yes, but you also have to stir up people's emotions. You have to appeal, in a word, to both notional and real assent.
So could you give me some examples of using both notional and real?
I'll give you an example. A movie came out a few years ago called Juno. It's about a young girl who becomes pregnant, and she's wrestling with the decision whether to abort the child. And she's come to the conclusion, yes, she will. And she goes to the abortion clinic, and there are a few protesters outside, and they're shouting slogans and so on. As she goes past them, one of the protesters says, "Your baby has fingernails." Then she goes inside the clinic, and she sits down to wait. And while she's there, she sees all these people drumming their fingernails on the chairs and so on. And then she gets up and she leaves. And she does not have the abortion, she has the child. And that scene always struck me as very Newman-esque. That young girl, I'm sure, had heard a lot of the arguments about abortion. She'd heard pro-life arguments. But what convinced her not to have the abortion was not an argument. It was this very real appeal, this visceral connection that, yes, the baby I'm carrying has fingernails. That's what moved her finally to say, no, I'm going to have this child. My guess following Newman is it was some combination of both notional and real that led her to that decision.
What kind of advice would you give Catholics today who want to evangelize?
Well, I would say follow John Henry Newman. In other words, often we just argue past each other. So one side launches an abstract argument, the other side launches another one back, and they go beyond each other. I think a good evangelist uses everything in his or her arsenal. Abstract arguments, of course, and we should use those. Newman loved the notional level, but use hunch, instinct, experience, memory, appeal not just to ideas, but appeal to visceral emotion. Use all of it, because you never know what's going to move somebody. Think of those famous cases of people that were converted to the faith by looking up at a rose window in a cathedral. It wasn't an argument, it was the splendor, the beauty of that particular rose window. Or often it's the moral example of someone, you know, a saint's life that leads someone to say, yes. So I think Newman is a very important figure there, so we don't just get stuck in our heads. Why is John Henry Newman a pivotal player? At a time when modernity was posing a serious threat to Christianity, Newman did not shrink from the challenge. Rather, he went out to meet the modern objections with confidence, intelligence, and panache. His intellectual base was in the fathers of the church, but he understood Locke and Hume just as well. His thought represents a thrilling dialogue between the ancient faith and modernity. At a time when subjectivism and sentimentalism, what he termed liberalism, was threatening classical Christianity from within, Newman responded with a bracing insistence on the objective integrity of the church's dogmas. At a time when many felt that a self-respecting intellectual of the modern age could not believe in the biblical view of the world, Newman, both by the acuity of his mind and the witness of his life, proved this false.